All right, so here we have our coverage code of priority on our make item. You'll notice that with priority, a lot of my fields here are disabled. For example, when I have manual set here, I have coverage time fence, negative days, positive days available to me. But with priority, a lot of that goes away because with priority, we're not focusing so much on demand as the driver of our planned orders. Instead, we're really focusing on hand consumption. Okay, so we have three values in order to help manage when to create those orders based on consumption. We have our minimum value, our reorder point, and our maximum point. And as you can imagine, maximum sits on top of the reorder point and reorder point sits on top of the minimum. So let me go ahead here and just input some example values. What we're telling the system here is, hey, whenever we have our on-hand quantity go below the reorder point, we want to start creating a fulfillment order in order to bring it back up to the maximum. Depending on where that on-hand amount is in relationship to our maximum, reorder point, and minimum, we're going to tell the system what priority value to assign to the fulfillment order. So for example, if our on-hand quantity is just a few units below the reorder point, that's going to be a low priority. But if it's below the reorder point and the minimum value, where it's going to be a high priority point. And we determine all of that on the planning priority models page. So let's go over there now and take a look. We can do so by going to master planning, setup, planning priority models. And by the way, what are some of the reasons why we might want to use priority? Well, it's really great for items that have essentially frequent urgent orders or supply constraints. We really need that top-down view to point us in the direction of something that needs to be done right away. We also want to use the priority model if we need to prevent stockouts, okay, for critical items that don't necessarily need to follow chronological demand dates. We can also even use it for customers or orders that take precedence over others. Because imagine if you're using just a regular old requirement coverage code, and then for another item using the priority coverage code, that priority coverage coded item is going to really stand out much more on the planned orders page. Okay. But here we can see our planning priority models where we set up the method of calculating what is and isn't a high priority or low priority item. This is an example of one that I put together earlier. At the top here, we can see the name and description of this planning priority model, but we can also see the calculation method, the planned order creation, and whether or not to consider demand priority. Consider demand priority is linked to this tab down here. We can essentially, if we're creating manual sales orders, purchase orders, transfers, production orders, or demand, we can assign a default priority amount that feeds into our planning engine. Once again, when we're creating any of these manually. And so for example, on a scale of 0 to 100, I can say that when I have a new manually entered sales order, I'm going to assign it a planning priority value of 40. Okay. And having this toggle turned on is telling the system, hey, consider that value coming from that sales order. But when it comes to this tab here, planning priority ranges, this is where we're setting up that relationship on a consumptive basis, on-hand basis between that maximum, reorder, and minimum value. We know that we're using priority ranges because we've chosen it here in the planned order creation tab. We have a couple options. We can either split according to priority ranges, or we can create a single supply with most important priority. Okay? Let's talk about these for a minute. So split according to priority ranges. This is going to create planned orders for each planning range for a particular item. For example, if I have two sales orders with 10 and 40 as their respective planning priority values, the planning engine is going to create two separate planned fulfillment orders instead of just one order for the most urgent sales order. Alternatively, single supply with most important priority, the planning engine will create one planned order for the most urgent demand on an item. As you can imagine, this has the potential to ignore less urgent demand. So I prefer this one. Priority calculation method. Currently, we're using priority ranges, as you can see down here. If we wanted to, though, we could base our priorities just on the percent of on hand as it is related to the maximum inventory quantity that we saw earlier on our item coverage page. A little less control there. You're giving over quite a bit to the system in order to make that judgment of what's a priority or not, but might be useful. Today, though, I'm going to be showing the priority ranges because I think it's quite a bit more dynamic. So here, as we create each of these lines, we can add a description in here, and then from quantity to quantity and percent of to quantity. We'll make one of these here in a second, which is going to make a little more sense. But just in order to read this here, we're saying the lowest planning priority, which means the most urgent planning priority item, from quantity 0 or less to quantity 0, with a percent of the to quantity, meaning this field here at 100%, that has our highest planning priority value, essentially just saying, hey, we have none in stock. And then the from quantity on the next line is just taking the to quantity field from the previous line. So now we're saying from quantity of 0 to quantity minimum inventory quantity, but 20% of minimum inventory quantity. And so what we're looking at instead is a range from 0 to 20% of our minimum that we saw earlier in our item, on our item coverage group page, on our item coverage page. Our next planning priority value going up from there is just taking the to quantity from our previous line. And so automatically it's populating the from quantity here as 20% of minimum inventory quantity to that reorder point. 100% of it is going to be a planning priority value of 30, and so on and so forth from there. Okay. But what does it look like when we actually create this? So let's try this. Let's type in demo. We're using priority ranges, single supply with most important. We can turn on consider demand just for fun. And then as I select add, the system's automatically going to take me through those different ranges. Okay. So for example, zero or less to, and I can choose minimum, reorder, maximum, or infinite. Okay. So this is a really handy, smart page in my opinion. For example, if I want to just choose minimum inventory quantity, okay, I can say 50%, select add, and now the next from quantity automatically created as 50% of minimum inventory quantity with a to quantity of the reorder point. Let's say I want that at 80% of reorder point. Now the next one that I add automatically has 80% of reorder point to the maximum inventory quantity. If I just select add again, I don't do anything. Then it's going to take that 100% of maximum inventory quantity, and the next item is going to, of course, have to be to quantity of infinite. And there I have my planning priority set up. So I can modify these as needed to create as many lines as possible for different planning priorities to have. So after I've created that, I then need to apply it to my coverage group. I can do so by going over to master planning, setup, coverage groups. All right. And here, for example, in our default, I have this little field here, planning priority model. Select that dropdown, and here I have all of those planning priorities models that we just saw. Okay. I take my coverage group, I assign it to my released product, run against it, and there we go. So what would I see as an output perhaps? Well, I can't run it as said, but what I'll end up having is planned orders populated in order to bring me back to that maximum, and in this planning priority field, a priority value associated to it based on the ranges that we saw earlier. So as we saw earlier, it was either 10, 20, 30, or 40 values. I would have those values placed in here depending on the on-hand quantity for those different items associated with my planned orders.